So in this session, we're going to be looking at vestments dating mainly from the 5th to 12th century, though I may stray a little bit further. It's based on a talk I did for my Reenactment Society conference in 2019, and they specialise in the period from 800 to 1066, though again, we stray further if required. Now, one of the points I was trying to make to them was that the top clergy were probably some of the flashiest men around. So I started by catching their attention with this amazing cope, made in Byzantium and gifted to the Bishop of Brixen in about 1000 AD. Perhaps the first thing that needs to be said is that very little survives in the way of clerical clothing from our period in England. The Reformation has an awful lot to answer for. These scraps are typical of what we can hope for. They're fragments of the burial robe of St. Cuthbert, now in the British Museum. We have plenty of illustrations in manuscript, but remarkably little actual fabric. Mercifully for us, however, the clothing of the clergy varied very little, being largely dictated by Rome, so we can draw on the more extensive wardrobes preserved in continental Europe, especially those areas where the Reformation did not take its toll. Even so, what survives is almost always of very high status, often in the form of relics, and does not necessarily reflect what was worn by your average parish priest. As today, the Church recognised three main orders of clergy: bishops, priests, and deacons. In this picture of early medieval ordination from the Landulf Pontifical, created in Italy about 970, we see an archbishop, Landulf, and 5 candidates for the priesthood, having stoles placed round their necks, and an archdeacon with a stole over one shoulder, deacon-wise. Incidentally, the rather weird hood-like structure over the archbishop's head is a square halo. It indicates a very saintly man who was still living at the time of the painting. Today, clerical clothing has changed very little in its essential from 1,000 years ago. The deacon wears an alb with a stole, which lies over the left shoulder and is fastened on the right hip. Over this, he may also wear a dalmatic, a square-cut tunic, often with strips of decorative apparel. Generally, the priest wears an alb with a stole round his neck. The stole may be crossed and tucked into the cincture, the belt of the alb, but this is more usual when it's going to be worn with a chasuble over the top. Bishops wear similar clothing to that of priests, except of course there are additions of mitre, pectoral cross, episcopal ring, and crozier. Alternatively, a cope may be worn over the alb. The Roman undergarment was the colobia, a woolen tunic, generally short and sleeveless, fastened on the shoulders. Later, towards the 4th century, it acquired sleeves up to the wrists and became ankle length. It was usually made of white or light-coloured wool, so it became known as an alb, albus meaning white. It might be adorned with 2 purple stripes, called clavi, more or less wide according to the wearer's status. Both these styles of tunic were worn unbelted at home, but were belted in public. So this 3rd century fresco in the Catacomb of Priscilla in Rome shows people worshipping, dressed in garments remarkably reminiscent of modern vestments that are almost certainly just ordinary clothing, though the head covering of the central figure is reminiscent of the Jewish prayer shawl. It would seem that this worship is taking place in the home, as no belt is being worn. In the very early days of the church, there were no specified vestments, but clothing was to be clean and bright for all. In the mid-3rd century, Pope Sylvester specified that deacons should wear a sleeved dalmatic rather than the sleeveless colobia. Now, by the mid-7th century, the items that were the signs of the various orders have been more or less defined. In 633, the Council of Toledo ruled that if a cleric had been degraded from his order and was reinstated, he should receive back the symbolic items of his office. So a deacon would receive back his stole, a priest his stole and his chasuble, a bishop his stole, chasuble, ring, and staff. It was also at this council it was dictated that deacons should wear their stole outside the alb, so the distinction between them and subdeacons was evident. In this pre-Toledo mosaic of about 546 in San Vitale in Ravenna, the tonsured figure with the book is presumably a deacon. There is no visible distinction between his clothing and that of the subdeacon at the end, holding a thurible. In this 6th century mosaic from San Vitale in Ravenna, Bishop Ecclesias is shown presenting a model of the church with his hands covered. This mosaic shows very clearly the layered look of the early church. Over his plain white alb, he wears a stole priestwise. Over this is a dalmatic with an ornately jeweled or embroidered edge. The dalmatic itself appears to be of figured silk and has red and white claves with what appear to be small red tags down one edge. Over all this, he wears a full purple chasuble, and over that another stole worn bishop-wise. This clearly shows the origins of the pallium, later reserved for archbishops. Different colours are used today to denote different seasons in the liturgical year. Green, white, red, and purple are used as in this diagram. However, the early Christians made no systematic use of colour. And when Constantine gave Bishop Macarius in Jerusalem a sacred robe fashioned with golden threads for use at baptism, this was probably simply a splendid display piece rather than the colour having any particular significance. However, toward the end of the 4th century, Jerome does refer to shiny white garments to be worn by celebrants of the Eucharist. The modern colour sequence was first outlined in Pope Innocent III's treatise De Sacra Altaris Mysterio, written before his election as Pope in 1198. White, representing purity, was used on all feasts of the Lord and the feasts of confessors and virgins. Red was used at Pentecost, recalling the fire that descended on the apostles, and also at feasts of martyrs, representing blood. Black was to be used on fast days and at commemorations of the departed. But purple, seen as a diluted black, was used for Advent and Lent. Green was to be used on other days for no other reason that it was not white, red, or black. This is Pope Innocent III in a 13th century fresco in Subiaco in Italy. The earliest English colour rules we have are from the 13th century. 5 survive from Sarum, Lichfield, Lincoln, Wells, and Westminster. A slightly later sequence from Salisbury makes use of multicoloured vestments for all the major feasts, specifying for Epiphany that the colour is unimportant so long as they're sprinkled with stars. The starry mantle of Henrik II, who died in 1024 at Bamberg, was given by him to the cathedral to be used as a cope, and it would seem to fit the bill for an Epiphany garment absolutely superbly. So we move on to the clothes of the clergy. And this illustration shows a bishop vesting from a French pontifical of the 15th century. So he's in his alb, his stole, he's got his amice over his head, and somebody is about to hand him a chasuble. The first item of clothing to be put on was the amice, a rectangle of linen with corner ties, which covered the shoulders and the back of the neck, presumably to protect the valuable cloth of the chasuble from sweat and grease. The 9th century Admonitio Synodalis bans the saying of Mass without amice, alb, stole, maniple, and chasuble. The vesting books of instructions as to how the priest should get ready for services, dating from this period, make it clear that at that time the priest wore a plain amice. It would not appear to have been very visible and does not show up in contemporary illustrations. Early vesting prayers read, "Protect my shoulders, O Lord, with the grace of the Holy Spirit, and gird my spirit, so that I may sacrifice to you, God who lives and reigns forever." This implies that the amice was simply put round the shoulders and tied as shown in this illustration from the 1911 Encyclopedia Britannica. By the 11th century, things seem to be changing. A prayer that appears in later vesting books shows that a different way of wearing the amice has been introduced. "Place upon my head, O God, the helmet of salvation to conquer and overcome diabolical errors and the fury of my persecuting enemies." As a side effect of this method of wearing, when the amice forms a collar over the outer vestments, we start to see the amice being decorated with a strip of rich fabric, often embroidery, known as an apparel. The survival of these items is incredibly rare, as they were so heavily used and frequently laundered, and none survive from our period, though 1 or 2 apparels for amices do, because the apparels would be pinned on or tacked or pinned on so they could be taken off to be washed for washing. This 14th century amice from the Benedictine convent at Engelberg is probably pretty similar to earlier apparelled amices. It's a plain white linen with silk embroidery on the apparel. The alb was the long white linen garment that formed the basic clothing of the clergy. The vesting prayer was, "Clothe me, O Lord, in the vestment of salvation, and gird me in the garment of joy." Early albs were untailored garments, usually undyed, with wide flowing sleeves, as is clear from the figures on this mosaic from San Vitale. These were soon found to be impractical for certain liturgical functions, notably baptism, in a time when this inevitably meant immersion, and a variant known as the baptismal alb, with tight-fitting sleeves, was introduced for the purpose. It is from these that the modern alb is descended. This drawing is from a 9th century pontifical in San Minerva Library in Rome. One of the earliest albs surviving into modern times is this 12th century alb of St. Hugo at La Velle Sainte by Charmey in Switzerland. These photographs were taken in 1906, and I am not certain if the garment still exists. I've certainly not been able to find any modern photos of it. But it is a lovely piece of work. There's a wonderful mixture of decorative techniques, especially considering this is an undergarment. White work embroidery, pulled thread work, tablet weaving, and Italian shirring, which is a variation of smocking, all in white, though there is evidence of remnants of coloured silk embroidery as well. The linen of the alb is 30 threads per centimetre, and the height of the shirring is 4.2 centimetres. There's a seam in the middle of the shirred area. And so you've got this great gathering, whoops, sorry, it's okay. Under the arm, which gives an enormous amount of fabric in the skirt, so to speak. Enclosed in a reliquary in the church of Santa Maria Maggiore in Rome is the reputed alb of Thomas à Becket, martyred in 1172. In 1992, the reliquary was opened to study the alb. It proved to be of incredibly fine white linen, made either in England or northern France, and dating from the late 12th century. Here, the thread count is about 40 threads per centimetre. And the stitching is also very, very fine. There is no shoulder seam, the garment being made from a length of linen about 3.25 metres long. Like St. Hugo's alb, the neck opening has a side slit, and the neckline was reinforced by a narrow strip of linen that formed a button at one end and a loop at the other. All at the sides are gauze, which are drawn to a point at the top with smocking stitches. While the decorative stitching on the side seams continues up the shoulders, the sleeves are cut in one piece with the body of the alb, showing the fabric to have been originally just under 2.5 metres wide. The sleeves are very narrow, and square gussets have been inserted under the arm to give freedom of movement. Far more elaborate is this apparelled alb, also attributed to Thomas à Becket at Sens. The apparels on this alb are extremely lavish and worked in silk thread on blue silk. Here you can see a detail of the embroidery of the apparel. Amazing stuff. This alb is known as the alb of St. Bernulf, who died in 1056, and the basic plain alb, very similar in cut to that of Becket, seems likely to be his and to date from the mid-11th century. The sleeves, unlike those of Becket's alb in Rome, are cut separately, and again the tops of the gauze are smocked. However, the garment is heavily ornamented with gold and silver brocaded tablet back patterns, and these have been dated to the 12th century and seem to be Sicilian in origin. Apparels on albs in general seem to date from the beginning of the 12th century and normally would not have gone right round the hem as they do here, which constricts the fall of the gauze and makes movement very difficult. It suggested these apparels were added after the alb had been retired from active service as a later donation to the relics of the saint. It's now housed in the Rijksmuseum in Utrecht. What's clear from all these albs is the huge amount of fabric gathered down the sides of these garments, very different from the plain T-shaped Roman tunic from which they derive. Over the alb went the cincture, or cingulum, a sash-like belt which was often highly decorated. This was generally associated with chastity. Gird, O Lord, the loins of my heart and body with the cincture of purity, and quench in my heart the humour of lust. The cingulum of Whitgarius is a tablet-woven girdle of silk dating from the 9th century. It's woven using 90 tablets in a straightforward balanced pattern. 80 of the tablets are threaded with red silk and the border tablets yellow-green. Gold thread is then used as a brocading thread, passing through the fabric, so one side has gold letters on a red background and the other red letters on a gold one. The terminals are woven in a red and white 3-1 twill, and white areas are brocaded in gold thread. The edges of the terminals are decorated with river pearls. The inscription records that the Queen Emma, the wife of Louis II, who died in 876, gave the belt to Wittgar, who was then Bishop of Augsburg. Very, very posh piece of work. Also from 9th century Augsburg is the belt of Eilbekunda, which owes its survival to the fact that it had a reputed relic of the Blessed Virgin attached to it. This was woven on 92 tablets, apart from the border threads, all in red silk. By changing the direction of twist on the weave, you can pick, the makers could pick out letters and the inscription is produced. One of those subtle pieces of work that you wouldn't know, you need to look at it in a certain light to see there's any decoration at all. Another apparent girdle here. This piece from the tomb of St. Cuthbert at Durham is far less well known than the stole and maniple, and appears to be the remains of another superb embroidered girdle. This is a computer simulation of how the lettered cingulum would have been worn, with narrow ties attached to the main girdle, actually confining the alb, so that the inscription can be seen. This is based on remains of a 12th century stole and cingulum from a clerical grave in the church of St. Peter and St. Paul in Krzywica in Poland. A similar way of tying is shown in the brocaded tablet weave cingulum of St. Edmund, Archbishop of Canterbury, now in Sens Cathedral. You can see it there. The dalmatic is the tunic-like garment worn by deacons. Tunicals are almost exactly the same thing, slightly less ornamented and worn by subdeacons. At our period, it was worn by all orders of clergy, and in fact, until relatively recently, Catholic bishops continued to wear the dalmatic under the chasuble. A vesting prayer used when putting on the dalmatic read, "Put on me, O Lord, the new man, who according to God is created in the justice and holiness of truth." The embroidery is known as the chasuble of St. Harlindis and Relindis, early 8th century abbesses at Marseille, are among the earliest pieces known. The work was almost certainly not done by these ladies, but is Anglo-Saxon work dating from the late 8th or early 9th centuries. They're not in their original form, but were remounted later, probably in the 13th century. Shape looks inappropriate for a chasuble, and they may well have been on a dalmatic originally. If not, they were mounted up that way in the 13th century. They are worked in silk and gold thread, with pearls on linen, and are now mounted on silk. Here are details of the embroidered roundels on it, arcading patterns, and the monograms. Which that pattern represents Alpha and Omega. And those are embroidered on linen that has been painted blue rather than dyed. You can see the blue linen there showing through. This elegantly fitted dalmatic, associated with St. Ulrich of Augsburg, who died in 973, was found in his grave along with other episcopal vestments when it was opened in 1183, and has since then been kept in the church of St. Alpha and St. Ulrich in Augsburg. Ulrich was right-hand man to kings and emperors. Otto I gave him the right to mint coins, so he was perfectly able to afford garments of Byzantine silk like this. Other vestments from the grave are clearly 10th century, so it seems reasonable to assume this one is as well. The garment is not particularly well preserved. The 19th century antiquarians took sizable samples, including one now in the V&A. This image shows the back, which is much better preserved than the front. Both front and back are cut side by side from a single length of silk. The starting border shows on the shoulder seam. The tapering sleeves are cut straight at the shoulder and the cuffs. Neck trim and clavi are cut from the same fabric as the chasuble from the same grave. I said that samples were taken for the V&A. Here is the sample in question. This gives us a much better idea of its colour, with light brown silk wraps, warps, and purple, dark green, and cream wefts woven in 3-1 twill. And here is an even closer detail of this extraordinary fabric. Dalmatics, like copes, were also part of the regalia for kings and emperors. This extraordinary garment is the coronation dalmatic of Emperor Henry II, who died in 1024. And this is in the cathedral treasury at Bamberg. Initially, it appears to be made for a two-headed man, but the long slit enables the anointing of the emperor over the heart as part of the coronation ritual. This copy of the garment shows what it would have looked like in wear. The stole is probably the oldest priestly garment and one of the first to be specified as essential. It was adopted as a sign of Christianity during the persecutions of Domitian, only gradually becoming the marker of an ordained minister. Even if a priest wears no other vestment for celebrating communion, he will wear a stole. The prayer associated with putting it on went, "Place the stole of justice around my neck, O Lord, and purify my heart of all sinful corruption." It was worn over one shoulder by deacons and round the neck and hanging down by priests. And in the early church, flung over the left shoulder, the one side flung over the left shoulder while the other hung down by bishops. This photograph shows the typical size and shape of a stole in our period, that long strip running down the table. It's an early 12th century one in the collection of Victoria and Albert, and this shows a visit by reenactors to look at the early textiles in their collection. The picture at the bottom shows the back of the stole. No, sorry, it's face down in the big picture, and the detail is the right side. One of the finest pairs of maniple and stole comes from the body of St. Cuthbert at Durham. These superb examples of gold embroidery and tablet weave date from the early 10th century. They were probably presented to Cuthbert's shrine, then at Chesterford Street, just north of Durham, when King Athelstan, son of Edward the Elder and stepson of Elfled, whose capital was at Winchester, paid a visit to the shrine in 934 and donated a number of garments, including a stole with a maniple. Both stole and maniple have inscriptions worked on the back of the terminal panels saying, "Elflad had this made for the pious Bishop Frithstan." Frithstan was Bishop of Winchester and seems to have protected Elflad's sons from Athelstan, thus rendering him unpopular with the king. It would seem likely, therefore, that these splendid vestments never reached Frithstan, or that they were confiscated from him and donated to the saint. Technically, the embroidery on both garments was worked on a ground of material of fine silk net, most of which has now disappeared. For most of the outline of the figures, use was made of stem stitch, though split stitch is also used. Surface couch gold thread was used for the background. The stole shows Old Testament prophets, and if all 16 were shown, as seems likely, it would have been about 10 foot long. However, today just under a yard of it survives. They centre around a figure of the Lamb of God placed at the centre. Here we have the stole, the singular maniple, and all the other little bits of the Pope Clement II. They date from 1047 when he was buried at Bamberg Cathedral. Like the other vestments in this burial, these were simple of cut and ornament, but made from the most lavish of Byzantine silk. Also in the V&A collection is this superb Samite stole, probably made in the 11th century in Germany from Byzantine silk. The woven patterns of roundels and foliage reminiscent of the vestments of Pope Clement II. And here we have a detail of the embroidered, the brocaded tablet woven fringe. Just a little tiny bit at the bottom of it, but isn't it beautiful? An important survival is the stole at the Church of St. Donat in Arlon. It is among the items said to have been lodged at the church by an anonymous gentleman during the French Revolution, who brought them for safety from Cambron. It appears their original owner was St. Bernard of Clairvaux, who visited Cambron in 1151 and lodged a set of his vestments there for safekeeping. They seem to be made of tablet woven linen, dyed with woad and madder. While these are technically superb, the Cistercian simplicity is clear in the use of inexpensive materials, or relatively inexpensive. These are fragments of a stolen maniple found in the tomb of William de Blois in Worcester Cathedral. While this should date them to the 1230s, they were examined in 2006 by Linda Woolley of the V&A, who felt that the fragments might well be of an earlier date, perhaps late 11th century. This renders it likely they belonged to St. Wulfstan and were buried with Bishop de Blois because of their sanctity. They seem to provide a parallel with the stolen maniple of St. Cuthbert, though a lot less costly and a lot less sophisticated. We move on to chasubles. The chasuble is a poncho-like garment worn by priests and bishops for celebrating the Mass. It was given at ordination, though at certain times of the year it could also be worn by deacons. When putting it on, the priest would pray, "Robe me, O Lord, in the ornament of humility, love, and peace." I have to admit, when I look at these wonderful silk chasubles, I do wonder about humility. The earliest form, and the one worn in our period, was the bell chasuble, which was simply a vast semicircle of fabric sewn together down the centre front. This is one of two bell chasubles attributed to St. Willigilis, the Archbishop of Mainz, who crowned Henry II as King of Germany in 1002. Both were made of yellow Byzantine samite and date from the end of the 10th century. This one came from St. Victor's Church in Weisenau, while the other was in Mainz Cathedral, and continued to be worn for masses on Willigilis' feast day until 1942. The silk of which this chasuble is made seems to have been woven on a loom at least 250 centimeters wide. They were originally completely plain, with no seam down the back. They must have looked spectacular in use, as candlelight caught the elaborate patterning of the silk. The vertical brocaded tablet woven braids and those around the neck seem to have been added in the 12th century, while the wide orphreys are of samite and seem to date from the 15th century. As might be imagined, these were not the most practical of garments when handling the delicate silverware, books, and the host itself on the altar. It became standard for most of this huge piece of cloth to be thrown back over the shoulders, so the priest's hands were unencumbered. This 11th century fresco at St. Clemente in Rome shows St. Clement with his bell chasuble thrown back over his shoulders to allow free movement. The black chasuble appears to be decorated with silver flowers, either embroidered or made of silver sheet. Back to this beautiful thing, the eagle chasuble at Brixen, it dates to about 1000 AD. Made at the court of the Emperor of Byzantium and given to Bishop Albuin of Brixen, it was probably one of the first silk garments to arrive in Western Europe. This garment was originally unlined with narrow ribbons inside protecting the seams and neckline. The background dye used on this chasuble is Tyrian purple, which makes it clear this is the product of the imperial workshops of Byzantium. The other colours used are a greenish black and a yellow. Narrow orphreys of gold protect the central seam on the back and form a wide cross. The garment would have been cut from a single piece of very wide imperial silk, woven on a loom at least 11 foot wide. The chasuble of Clement II, who was buried at Bamburgh Castle in 1047, is made of Byzantine silk in a samite weave. The intricacy of the pattern and the fine sheen of the golden silk makes any ornamentation entirely unnecessary. And this one has remained, because it was buried with him in its original condition, so no tablet braid trims, no orphreys, nothing like that. Again, tape protecting the seams, and otherwise it's just this wonderful piece of fabric. The early 11th century St. Vitalis chasuble at Salzburg is similar in shape to Pope Clement's vestment, but here the neck edges and front seam are covered with intricate golden orphreys. This is a truly astonishing piece of work. The orphreys are of silk and gold, brocaded tablet braid bands, further intricately ornamented with seed pearls and precious stones in gold wire settings. And here we have details of the gold brocaded tablet bands and the beadwork and cabochons in gold wire settings. Just how many years' work would that have taken? Doesn't bear thinking about. This is the chasuble of St. Wolfgang, dating to about 1050 in Regensburg. It maintains the bell shape of the last two chasubles, but it's ornamented with a pattern of bold orphrys forming a Y cross. The embroidery shows bands of alternating birds and leopards biting into floral spirals. Incredible pieces of embroidery and gold work. This is a fine chasuble supposedly owned and worn by Thomas à Becket, and it survives at Sens. The shape is showing the first signs of evolving from the bell form into a pointed oval or Gothic shape. This copy of the chasuble was commissioned in 1901 and forms the core of the fine set used by modern archbishops of Canterbury to celebrate their first Eucharist in the cathedral. Here's another handsome bell chasuble attributed to Becket in the cathedral at Tournai, and that's dated to 1170 or thereabouts. Its orphrys are of gold brocade on an unbleached silk tablet band. This is the late 12th century chasuble attributed to St. Bernard of Clairvaux in the treasury at Aachen. It's a spectacular piece in plain blue silk with gold thread and pearl units forming a Y cross. But it does seem a remarkably lavish garment for one who was constantly condemning the wearers of lavish vestments. Much closer to the austerity that we associate with St. Bernard, and probably much more like what most clergy would have been wearing in our period, is the chasuble preserved at Arlon and thought to be among the vestments left by him at Cambron in 1150. These were subsequently brought to Arlon for safekeeping during the French Revolution. This is made of unbleached but high-quality linen. The raw edges on the neck and at the hem are covered with a red silk brocaded band, which is also used to form the Y cross orphrey. And the final spectacular chasuble, the chasuble of St. Yves in Loannec in Brittany. It's a semi-conical chasuble made of a mixed silk and linen fabric and thought that it dates from the late 12th century. These half silks, linen and silk, are attributed to Spanish workshops, and the griffin motifs, tree of life and rosette, are of Hispano-Moorish origin. The chasuble is entirely covered with this repeating pattern in embroidery, the motif representing a griffin gripping onto the tree of life. This embroidery is worked using strongly contrasting tones of gold of Cyprus, otherwise known as byssus or sea silk. This was produced in very small quantities from the long silky filaments or byssus secreted by a gland in the foot of pen shells found in the Mediterranean. The cloth produced from these filaments can be woven even finer than silk and was not generally dyed. Very few people knew the location of these shells or the processes of thread production, so vestments and clothing made with this fiber were greatly treasured. As things stand at the moment, there is one woman who is licensed to harvest byssus and who knows how to spin and weave it. It is hoped that she will pass those skills and knowledge on to her daughters. The maniple started out as nothing more or less than a handkerchief, something to wipe sweaty hands on and mop up spills. By the 10th century, it had ceased to be functional and had become completely ornamental, but its original function was pointed at in the prayer as it was put on, which says, "Give me, O Lord, virtue to wipe away all impure blemishes from my hands, so that I may be worthy of serving you free of bodily and mental defilement." This picture is from the Bayeux tapestry and shows Archbishop Stigand wearing his folded back chasuble, and it shows how at our period the maniple is still seen as a hand towel and is carried rather than worn over the arm. It's also interesting to note the artist is using license with the colours, as Stigand's pallium should be white. So we can't be sure whether the maniple and stole should match or not. They clearly don't. This is a fragment from the maniple of St. Ulrich in the Church of St. Ulrich and St. Afra in Augsburg. It probably dates from 973 and is an incredibly complicated piece of tablet weaving, showing the hand of God and the text Dextra Dei, the right hand of God. It was retrieved from Ulrich's grave in the 12th century, along with his dalmatic and chasuble, and is probably locally made, possibly in the convent of Benedictine nuns in Augsburg that Ulrich founded. The back shows an elaborately patterned base fabric with its repeating pattern. This modern copy of just one element of the pattern gives an idea of the craftsmanship. It's just makes you want to give up altogether, that stuff. The maniple of St Cuthbert at Durham dates from the early 10th century. Again, like the stole, it was probably presented to St Cuthbert's shrine by King Athelstan in 934. Inscriptions worked on the back of the terminal panels say that Aelfled had this made for Thristan, and it is decorated with figures of popes and attendant deacons. These centre on a picture of the hand of God with the figures hanging vertically from it. This is the maniple of St Bernard, matching that stole. Again, tablet woven and probably dyed with woad and madder. They seem to be entirely made of linen, though no analysis has been done. And on the basis of the difficulty of dyeing linen red, Claudia Volney thinks they might be silk. Her reconstruction in silk shows how striking these pieces would actually have looked. They're really amazing. This set of vestments, dating from about 1165, is supposed to have been worn by Thomas Becket. It includes a spectacular stole and maniple. There's a closer view of the maniple and a detail of the embroidery worked on silk on linen and then applied to a red silk backing. Moving away from the purely liturgical garments used to celebrate the sacraments, the cope is simply a semicircular cloak, originally for warmth, but it very soon became a vehicle for display. They were, through most of our period, seen as non-liturgical garments, which, however, could be worn by clergy during services. And it's only during the 12th century it becomes a specifically liturgical garment, seen as the special mark of a cantor. One of the most spectacular is the starry mantle of Emperor Henry at Bamberg Cathedral. St Henry received this secular mantle as a gift around 1020 and donated it to the cathedral for use in the liturgy. The cope as we see it today, however, is not quite what the one Henry received. Between 1453 and 1455, the embroidered ornaments were cut from the original dark purple silk twill mantle, which can still be glimpsed within the ornaments, and reapplied in more or less the same arrangement. Some inscriptions were slightly altered to a blue damask cloth. This detail from the center of the back shows the motifs cut out and remounted on blue damask. Christ in glory, surrounded by the evangelists and framed by the Alpha and Omega, is at the center of the saints and angels of heaven. Colored embroidery, which was in white, red, blue, and green silk, is particularly clear in the figures of the two saints at the top of the pictures. Most of the rest of it is rather all swamped by gold. Also in Bamberg Cathedral is the white mantle of St Kunigunda, who's Henry's wife, dating from the first quarter of the 11th century. The liturgical nature of its decoration suggests that, unlike Henry's mantle, this piece was made specifically as a liturgical garment, probably a cope, possibly a bell chasuble, but it may well have been donated by Kunigunda. And in the center of the back here, we see Christ in Majesty, surrounded by the personifications of the Advent O antiphons. O sapientia, O rex gentium, O Virgo virginum quomodo, O Emmanuel, O clavis David, O radix Jesse. If you know the hymn, O come Emmanuel, you've met the O antiphons. And of the two Epiphany antiphons, Bethlehem known as Minima and Orieta Stella ex Jacob. This makes the purpose of the cope clear. It's a blue starry cope for Advent and Epiphany. Originally, it would have been a far more colourful affair, with much of the detail worked in stem stitch in white, red, and 2 shades of blue. But unfortunately, the dyes have now faded. There's also yet another cope attributed to Kunigunda at Bamberg. The main body of this cope dates from the 11th century, but the hood and the fringe were added in the 15th century, and it was remounted on fresh silk. The pearls with which all 3 mantles were richly studded were cut off and sold by weight during the Napoleonic secularization of 1802. Now move upmarket a little to the upper ranks of the clergy, the bishops and archbishops. Here we've got a couple of early bishops from about 645. Pope John IV and St. Venantius, shown in the 7th century mosaics of the chapel of St. Venantius in the Lateran Baptistry in Rome. They're wearing the pallium and spectacular pontifical sandals. In contrast, this drawing from a 10th century antiphona shows Pope Gregory the Great, inspired by the Holy Spirit, dictating to his secretary, the deacon Peter. He wears alb, dalmatic, stole, maniple, chasuble, and a more modern form of pallium. A bishop in 1018, St. Aubin drives a devil from a sick woman, from a manuscript in Angers. Note that he wears no mitre. These were not common outside Rome and were only granted to bishops at the personal choice of the Pope. He does, however, appear to be wearing a blue rationale over his chasuble. A quick point about the appropriate colours for bishops and archbishops. For most of our period, there was no specific colour laid down to mark the rank of bishop, though by 1059 it was customary for them to wear green. It was not till the Fourth Lateran Council in 1215 that green was made the required colour for patriarchs, bishops, and archbishops, and red was established for cardinals at the Second Council of Lyon in 1272. It was only in the 17th century that purple was established as an episcopal colour. Even now, in Catholic ecclesiastical heraldry, the hat and tassels of a bishop are shown as green. This is the coat of arms of the current Bishop of Middlesbrough. Probably the most recognisable item of bishop's clothing is the mitre, here seen in an early form on a fragment of a stole from the 12th century clerical grave in the Church of St. Peter and St. Paul in Krzywica in Poland. The early Greeks wore headgear more inclined to practicality than fashion, a rather hairy skull cap called a pilos, made of piled fabric. Other than changing the Greek pilos to the Latin pileus, the Romans used this skull cap on an everyday basis. And by the 8th century AD, the Pope wore the pileus to protect his head from the cold. And here we have a null-binding made pileus belonging to St. Bernard and dating from the 12th century. It's in extremely poor condition, probably because pilgrims would pinch a tiny bit of the holy textile to take home to their local church with them. It would appear not to have been made in Europe, as the fibre used to make it is cashmere. It appears to have a pile finish on the inside and looks remarkably warm. A variant of the Greek pilos was the camelaucum, originally a pilos with ear flaps worn by soldiers. The nobility and royalty would wear these, but made of rich material and decorated with a golden band and jewels. Eventually, only the golden band and jewels survived, and the camelaucum developed into a crown-like circlet known as the mitra. From these, a form of headgear evolved which began to be used by first the popes and then later the higher members of the clergy. The white linen pileus, known as the phrygium, acquired a stiffened point like a helmet and was combined with a band of gold, the mitra, to form the distinctive headgear of the Pope. This 11th century fresco at San Clemente in Rome shows the phrygium and band of gold, the predecessor of both the mitre and the papal tiara. St. Gregory, in the initial U from the letters of Gregory the Great, dating from about 1100, is shown wearing an early version of the mitre, where the two peaks seem to resemble horns. At this period, the use of the mitre, which before 1049 had been limited to popes, was beginning to be extended to bishops by the personal gift of the Pope to individual bishops. By the time of this 12th century wall painting in Durham, the use of the mitre was fairly general among bishops, and it has become accepted as formal episcopal headgear. This is the earliest surviving mitre from England and has traditionally been associated with, surprise, surprise, Thomas of Canterbury, though it's unlikely it was ever worn by him. The circles form the scrolling foliage originally contained jewels or metal ornaments. One of the lappets is original. The other, with the figure of an apostle on it, is from a different mitre, but of about the same age. And that's in the V&A. This mitre from Namur in Belgium is embroidered with silver gilt and silver thread and coloured silk embroidery, worked with underside couching, split stitch and stem stitch on a silk ground, and dates from about 1240. It's decorated with scenes of the deaths of Thomas Becket and St. Lawrence, and seems to be English work. Closely related, but probably not from the same workshop, is another mitre showing Becket's death from the Abbey of Seligenthal in Bavaria. It's made of 12th century Byzantine silk with early 13th century English embroidery in gold thread and multicolored silks. The gold thread is underside couched and the silks in stem and split stitch. And on its reverse is the stoning of St. Stephen. I find it quite interesting that both of them have the diaconal saints with Thomas of Becket. This mitre, now in the Abegg Foundation, but initially in St. Peter's Church, Salzburg, reached its present form about 1231. But it's made of fabrics that are far older than that. The fine white damask silk, the gold brocaded tablet bands, and the amazingly elaborate sumac and brocade silk bands that make up the falls of the mitre were all between 200 and 300 years old when it was made. Clearly, this was an important item made with materials that already had considerable significance. To start with, a 10th century Byzantine lampas silk was made into a simple and elegant mitre, probably in the 12th century, and ornamented with a gold silk brocade made in Sicily, and probably also 10th to 11th century. It's not clear whether the lappets were added then or later, but it is clear that they're the oldest item in the ensemble, dating from the early 9th century and almost certainly Anglo-Saxon. As the lappets are decorated on both sides, they probably originated as a stole or maniple and were ornamented with silver bosses. In order to give a degree of unity to the mitre, and I can't say I think it's very successful, some of the bosses were transferred to the vertical orphrey of the mitre. It suggested these pieces of sophisticated English work, maybe relics of an Anglo-Saxon missionary saint. I think what's clear from both the last two mitres is that a mitre provided a really good place for using small amounts of really rich and important fabric. So that they were, very often, these things would have started out as chasubles or what have you, but because they belonged to a saint or were treasured, they could be used on a mitre, which was a relatively new piece of kit. The crozier or pastoral staff is the badge of authority for bishops and represents a shepherd's crook. The ivory crozier of St. Gregory the Great from about 600 shows the Lamb of God trampling the devil in the form of a serpent. This is part of the decoration from the middle of a bishop or abbot's crozier and a reliquary excavated from a Viking woman's grave in Romsdal in 1961. The grave has recently been dated to about 820, and the crozier identified as coming from northern England from about 780 to 820. It's in the Norwegian Institute of Science and Technology in Trondheim, sadly not on public display. And here's a detail of part of the crozier. It's of gold-plated silver. It has then been sawn in half and used as a brooch. The prosperous crozier is the oldest securely dated complete crozier from the British Isles and was discovered around 1839 during turf cutting at a bog near Prosperous in County Kildare. Croziers generally take the form of a wooden staff covered by sheets of metal, typically of copper alloy, that are joined by knops or expansions along the shaft. This one appears to have been broken in two before being placed in the bog. The yew wood core of it has been carbon dated to the 10th century. The crozier drop is decorated with gas and chamleve enamel, and there's a secondary inscription on the underside of the drop indicating that at one time it belonged to St. Mary's Abbey, Dublin. This is the Kells crozier, part of the British Museum's collection since 1859. One of only 4 existing complete examples known from Ireland, it was found without explanation in the cupboard of a London solicitor's office in 1850, before being acquired by the museum. It was made by various craftsmen over at least 2 different periods between the late 9th and 11th century. While the core is wooden, the crook is of silver, and the staff is covered with copper alloy. At the straight end of the crook, a human head appears. This is where the crozier would once have held holy relics. Not all bishops' staffs were in the form of a crook. This tower-shaped crozier from Cologne dates from about 1000, and these were relatively common. This elegant crozier head dates from between 1175 and 1225. It's from southern Italy, and you can see signs that it was once painted. Probably there was a lost figure in the middle, almost certainly another Lamb of God. The other characteristic symbols of the bishop are his ring and his pectoral cross. This late 4th century mosaic of St. Ambrose, possibly a likeness made before his death in 397, shows him dressed simply in alb, chasuble, and stole. What distinguishes him as a bishop are his episcopal ring and his pectoral cross. This is the pectoral cross of St. Cuthbert. It's a fine golden garnet cross found in Cuthbert's coffin when it was opened in 1827. It may have been the one he wore in life, but more likely it's a piece given when he was buried in Durham Cathedral in 698, and it may actually be a piece of women's jewellery. This is a superb gold filigree pectoral cross set with a garnet, which was among the 8th century church treasures forming part of the Staffordshire hoard. The key sign of a bishop's authority has always been his ring, often set with amethyst, a precious stone in an expensive-looking colour that could be found in huge chunks. This episcopal ring dates from the 12th century. Sometimes they were also made of sapphire, like this 13th century ring in the Victoria and Albert collections. It's set with a sapphire, and the inside of the hoop bears an inscription, Ave Maria Gratia Plena. Very unusual survivals are this pair of episcopal gloves, dating from no later than 1101 at Sabina's Cathedral in Canossa di Puglia in southern Italy. They are knitted out of a smooth yarn, which makes them an extremely early example of European knitting. No analysis has been done, but it seems likely it's linen, and that the pattern knitting at the wrist was originally dyed red. The circular ornaments on the back of the gloves are discs of purple silk, embroidered with dyed reeled silks. They're trimmed with small pearls and glass beads, and seem to represent the resurrected Christ. The band across the figure, the left-hand one, seems to say Zoon, the living one, and the Blessed Virgin in the form of the Virgin of the Sign, showing the child already in her womb. For this you can compare the figure of the Virgin at Deerhurst, which would have been painted with this motif. These discs seem to have been a substitute for the enamel discs found on the back of some silk episcopal gloves. Clearly, medieval bishops were a thin-skinned lot and highly susceptible to cold. Presumably, bishops' palaces were a lot better heated than country vicarages. Not only did they celebrate the Mass in gloves, but in long, thick silk socks known as buskins. The buskins would be put on at the start of the service by one of the senior attendants, and then sandals would be put on over these. This pair of buskins, belonging to Clement II, date from 1047 and are of Byzantine silk. Inside they are lined with dark blue-black silk with a rosette pattern. These buskins are attributed to St. Germanus, an abbot of Mutier-Garnval in Switzerland, martyred in 675. Practically none of the clothing attributed to him is that early, and it's impossible to tell whether there was an attempt to fraudulently attribute them as relics, or whether they were vestments used at masses on his feast day. These buskins seem to date from the early 12th century and are made of null binding in linen. They're much simpler than those belonging to bishops, but they are still clearly high-status garments, as the one that survives intact has a trim of silk at the top. These splendid ones belong to Archbishop of Canterbury and Chancellor of England, Hubert Walter, and were found in his grave in Canterbury Cathedral. Over the buskins went liturgical sandals. These were originally just that, but before long they turned into slippers. These sheepskin sandals are attributed to St. Germanus, who died in 675, and it's entirely possible they were his, though we have no documentation of abbots being permitted to wear sandals until nearly 100 years later. These are slip-on shoes with a rather strange construction. The uppers and the front half of the sole are cut in one piece and joined with a seam near the back outer side and a seam along the center of the sole. A heart-shaped piece of leather is then inserted to complete the sole. A strap ties around the ankle to secure the shoe, and the embroidery is done in red silk using chain stitch. Similar in style, this 12th century pair from Sens, probably made in Italy, are said to have been worn by Thomas à Becket. Already by the 12th century, a style was starting to emerge that survived until the present day. Silk slippers with a thin leather sole made in silk of the liturgical colour and easy to slip on during the service. These ones at Sens also belong to Thomas à Becket. These slipper-type sandals are again from the grave of Hubert Walter, late 12th century. They're made of green silk with an additional cover of red silk on the soles and are made in one piece. They're very elaborately embroidered in silver gilt thread and further decorated with jewels, mainly carbuncles. The secular pallium, a long scarf-like garment ultimately derived from the toga, was worn over the penula, the garment from which the chasuble derives. Very early in the spread of Christianity, the pallium was adopted as something specifically Christian, and St. Justin is recorded as wearing one to his martyrdom in 168 AD. By the 3rd century, most Christians, lay and clerical, wore it, and it was adopted as episcopal wear by the Bishop of Rome in the 4th century. By the 5th century, it was a vestment in its own right, and specifically in the gift of the Pope. And by the 9th century, it was reserved for metropolitans and archbishops, and was not worn as of right, but by gift of the Pope. The earliest surviving pallia are 2 buried with St. Caesarius and dated to the 6th century. One is completely plain in a linen warp wool weft fabric, while the other one here bears a Cairo symbol at one end and is woven in a silk warp wool weft fabric. Both these are contained in purpose-made cases. The case, the strip on the left, dates from the 13th century and is made of Hispano-Moorish silk, embellished with prolific script. Caesarius' pallia would have been worn like this one, worn by Pope Innocent III, 1198 to 1216, in a 13th century fresco. This relief of St. Peter was made at Ivy Church about 1160 and shows the developed form of the pallium, a loose collar with a strip hanging down the front and the back. St. Gregory, Benedict, and Cuthbert shown wearing the pallium in the 12th century benedictional of St. Ethelwald. These days, metropolitan archbishops wear the pallium as of right, but it is still a gift from the Pope that a new metropolitan has to request. It's then formally presented within 3 months of their arrival in their see. During the 9th century, there started to be a move away from Jesus' teaching on clothing, consider the lilies of the field, to the need to glorify God by clothing his priests in splendor. This period saw the development of the rationale, as part of an emerging theory of religious clothing, emphasizing the hierarchical nature of the church. The rationale was based on the ephod worn by the high priests of Israel. Its adoption, that's the ephod, its adoption seems to have been an attempt to emphasize the status of the bishop at the top of the hierarchy. This 10th century rationale comes from the treasury of Bamberg Cathedral and has been reused on a 16th century chasuble. The link with the ephod can be clearly seen on the shoulder roundels, where the heads of the 12 sons of Jacob are represented along with their names. This 15th century drawing of the back of the Bamberg rationale shows Christ enthroned as judge of all the world, above the lamb with the open book and the 7 seals described in the Revelation of John. The symbols of the 4 evangelists surround the scene. John, the author of the Apocalypse, can be seen at the left, pointing to the lamb. On the right, the Archangel Michael descends. The busts of 6 apostles are placed at the sides, and below, the Emperor Henry II and Kunigunda, the patrons of the bishopric, have been added. They're missing on the textile. The front shows Christ as the peaceful king sending out his apostles. The whole thing emphasizes the power and kingship of Christ and the power of the bishop, who is his representative on earth. The rationale was never a common vestment, and today the Bishop of Eichstätt and the Archbishop of Paderborn are among the only 4 prelates who still use this form of vestment. Now, what they wore off-duty. Originally, there was no specific off-duty clothing for the clergy, and even the vestments closely resembled the clothing of the laity. We really can't tell whether any or all of these people are priests. Oops. The priest in this slightly baffling scene from the Bayeux tapestry is only distinguishable from a layman by his tonsure. Oh, and of course the caption, where 1 cleric and 11 Giffer, and his church. He's in fact remarkably smartly turned out, with red hose, a yellow tunic, and a blue and red striped cloak. And it's hard to work out whether he's blessing, caressing, or hitting Elfgifer. It may be a reference to an old story that Elfgifer, the first wife of Canute, had no legitimate children, but passed off offspring of a priest as hers. But what relevance it has to the story of William and Harold is hard to fathom. However, given the little gentleman below, who also seems to be tonsured, it clearly relates to some sort of scandal. Likewise, Archbishop Odo has no distinguishing marks of his holiness, beyond using a club rather than an edged weapon, as clergy were not supposed to draw blood. The inscription says, "Here is Bishop Odo with his big stick." In this 12th century manuscript, a paralytic is healed by putting on Cuthbert's shoes. Here the tonsure shows the left-hand figure is in holy orders, but otherwise his clothing is in no way distinctive. While Bishop Adelmar of Le Puy can be recognised as a bishop by his mitre worn fetchingly over a male coif as he rides to battle in the First Crusade. So just a few other bits that don't fit into any of the other categories, really. This is part of the Shroud of Charlemagne, with spectacular Byzantine silk with roundels containing charioteers, and typical of the really upmarket Byzantine silks. Contrast the plain brown wool tunic in which Caesarius was buried in 542. Caesarius was Bishop of Arles and an important person, yet the tunic is as simple as the garments worn by St. Francis. One of the oldest pieces of church embroidery to survive is the velamen, the humeral veil of St. Harlendis, dating from the 8th century and a superb piece of needlework. It's made of red and lichen purple brocaded silk with a lozenge pattern on it, possibly of Islamic origin. At each end, applied squares and crosses in a 7th century Byzantine silk. There are brocaded tablet woven edges of silk with brocading weft of spun gold. That is, gold sheet, cut very fine and then twisted round a single horsehair. Further ornamentation includes small gilded copper bosses, translucent blue and green glass beads, and pearls. Humeral veils prevent physical contact with an object, with the aim of showing that the authority associated with the object doesn't belong to the person holding it. They're used when the consecrated host is taken and shown to the congregation, as at benediction or at the close of a Maundy Thursday Mass. This curious object is a silk cruciform cushion from a reliquary of the jeweled cross, dating from the 8th, 9th century. You remember our initial beautiful chasuble? This is another piece, another silk item using the same weaving pattern as the eagle chasuble at Brixton, but in a completely different colorway. And this is the Shroud of St. Germain, preserved at Auxerre. Like the chasuble, it dates from about 1000. This is a null-binding hat belonging to St. Simeon. He was a Sicilian monk who was a guide to the Holy Sepulchre before joining a monastic order in Egypt. About 1030, the Archbishop of Trier asked him to join him in a pilgrimage to Jerusalem, and Simeon returned with him to Trier. Simeon then asked to live as a recluse in the great Roman gate of the city, the Porta Nigra. He was enclosed as an anchorite there and died on the 1st of June, 1035. His hat, thought to be made of camel hair, is preserved in the cathedral at Trier. I have recently heard, but not verified, that recent analysis has shown it to be sheep's wool of a very hairy variety rather than camel. But I think what is certain is it came with him from Egypt. And this early 12th century painted wood frontal from Douro in Catalonia shows the martyrdom of 5 saints. In the center is an image that at first view appears to be a Madonna and child, but is actually St. Julieta, St. Juliot in Cornwall, and Quiricus, St. Cyr. While most of these survived from Catalonia and Norway, it's likely these painted frontals were common, being a cheap imitation of rich textiles decorating the altar, and probably looks very much as textile frontals would have done at that period. God grant us a good end. We'll hope for a less dramatic end than these ones. And that's our end too. There we go.
Oh. Do you want to take next week?
Could I ask a question?
Yes.
The silk that they used, was that brought from China, or did they actually weave silk there?
So a lot of the early silk is from China, but by the 7th century, I think it's 7th, it might be 8th, the Byzantine clergy had smuggled silk from India. It had already, silk production had already shifted from China to, expanded to India.
Yeah.
Byzantine clergy managed to smuggle out silkworms to Byzantium, and so through most of the early medieval period, there is a flourishing, though imperial monopoly, silk industry in Byzantium. So
yeah,
the emperor has a monopoly on silk production, so silkworms and mulberries and all that stuff, and also on the purple dyes from Tyre. So these things like the eagle chasuble, it's a real piece of personal gift from the emperor. It's very much a monopoly thing. Silk production comes through to Italy in about the 15th century, and to France in the 14th century, and to France in the 15th century.
Right.
And in the 17th century, James I makes a spirited but totally failed effort to introduce it into England. He planted the wrong sort of mulberries.
Mulberries are very nice, though.
Well, they're very nice, but he planted black mulberries, and silkworms need white mulberries. He did this amazing sort of sponsored, everybody shall plant a mulberry tree sort of thing. It was totally pointless.
Yeah. The other thing I wondered, when did the tonsure come in for the clergy? Was it very early? The monks.
I honestly don't know. It's certainly prior to the Great Schism, because tonsuring was common to Orthodox and Catholic. But I'm honestly not certain of exactly when it comes in.
Oh, right.
Certainly they're tonsured by the 7th century. Certainly, I don't know how early it is.
I just wondered what reason was it. Vanity, or to make you less attractive, or what? Just to take a bit of hair off your head?
I don't know. I think there was a sort of certainly with the Celtic church, who had a different tonsure, was the idea that you were exposing your head and so your person to the sun, and so to the presence of God.
Oh, right.
But it also becomes very much, it's a badge of holy orders. It means you come under ecclesiastical law, not civil law. And so while you might let your hair grow out while you were staying at home, if you're going on a journey, the first thing that you did if you were in holy orders was to get your tonsure recut. So it was absolutely abundantly clear to everybody that you were not to be trifled with. And that applied to the minor orders, so everybody from the sexton up. You had orders of minor clergy, which the doorkeeper, the sexton, the reader, the acolyte, the exorcist, the subdeacon, and all of them were entitled to wear the tonsure.
So what happened to the poor souls that were just bald?
They might be able to get away with no murder, I should think.
Yes.
It was an advantage.
Yes, okay.
But of course, in those days, life expectancy was much shorter. So probably not as many men were balding quite as early as they seem to have.
Don't imply they do so now.
Yes. Catherine, you referred to the... Catherine,
Yeah.
Can I ask a question about that first chasuble
Yes.
and its location?
Yes, that's what I want.
You talked about Brixham, and I only know Brixham in Devon,
No,
and I'm sure it's not there.
Blixen. Ixen.
Oh, right.
Germany.
In Germany.
Yep.
I know very little of German history, I'm afraid.
Me too. I learn more all the time, but no, nothing like that would have got past the Reformation. It would have been turned into Queen Elizabeth or something.
Yeah, yeah.
No question that would have vanished.
Yeah.
It is the real shame that apart from one or two things like Cuthbert stuff, there's so little survives from medieval at all in England.
Unfortunately.
Very good.
Mm, mm.
Very good.
Right, thank you.